Well, we finally made it to chapter 12, where we're going to talk about looping. So in this video, you're going to learn about the two main types of loops that we use in Java. I'm going to help you understand when it makes the most sense to use each type of loop. And we're going to write a program that explores two common ways to use a while loop in your program. Now that you've learned about logical expressions when we talked about decision making and arithmetic expressions in the prior chapter, it's time to start talking about loops. Computers are really good at doing the same thing over and over and over again. And in coding, this is what we call looping. Looping is kind of like a dog that chases its tail, going around and around and around. But usually with computers, we do it with a purpose. Well, they don't always do that. Dogs don't always do that. See, loops let us run within our program the same block of code many times. And even though we're doing it over and over again, it doesn't mean that what's happening inside of that block is exactly the same every time. We'll talk more about that. Here are some reasons that you might want to use loops. You might want to add up a set of numbers that you don't know how many there are when you start out. So we could ask the user to input a number of numbers. We don't even know how many. And then we could add them all up. We can count to a specific number, like counting from 1 to 10. We can read a file with a number of records that we're not even sure how many there are. We can loop until we reach a specific value, or we make a particular decision. And then we also use loops working with arrays and collections, and you'll learn about those more in a future chapter. But there are two different kinds of loops that are typical within all languages, and especially in Java: the for loop and the while loop. We use the for loop when we know ahead of time how many times we're going to go through the loop. And with a for loop, you start out by telling the computer where to start, how often, when to stop, and then how to increment. So here's an example of this in the code. So for, and then within the parentheses, you have three sections. The first section declares a variable that you're going to use to kind of keep track of how many times you're going through. That's what count does here. And you're setting it to an initial value, in this case 0. The second section is the logical expression. So count is less than 10. It is going to continue to loop while count is less than 10. And then the third section is an accumulator to bring count ultimately to be more than 10 so that the loop can finish. And then whatever we write inside is what will be executed over and over and over again. A while loop can do the same thing, but it also can do some different things. We use a while loop usually when we don't know how many times we're going to repeat a process. And a while loop is a little different than a for loop because it's going to use a variable outside that kind of gets initialized outside of the while loop. So here's an example. While in our for loop, if you remember, we declared count within the while loop, like within the parentheses. And in this case, we declare it and set the value to 0 outside of the while loop. So count starts at 0. The while loop also has a logical expression. Count is less than 10. It does something within this block, and then it has the accumulator at the end, count plus plus. This block of code and the one that we looked at with the for loop do exactly the same thing, just in a slightly different way. While loops, though, can be a lot more than just what we had in the prior example. In fact, here's an example that uses a Boolean variable. Now, if you remember way back to variables, Boolean is a variable that is either a true or a false. So we're going to declare a variable called isDone, and we're going to initialize it to false. And then within our while loop, we have a logical expression that is not, that's the exclamation point, not isDone. This basically means while isDone is false. We're going to do something. And within that do something, we have a decision that we're going to make, whatever it is, but under certain conditions, isDone is going to equal true. So that means that when something happens that is true within the if statement there, isDone is true, comes back up to the while side, and now rather than it being false, it's true, and the loop will complete. So that's an example of a second example of how we would use a while loop. Now, in your try section that comes up here in a minute, you're going to look at a couple of other examples of how to use looping within your program. Wow, aren't loops interesting? Well, now it's time to take what we've learned and try it in an exercise. The requirements for this exercise are as follows. We want to use a loop to add up 5 numbers that the user enters in the keyboard and then display the results. Pretty simple, right? Well, here's what the pseudocode will look like. First, we need to initialize our counter variable, right? We have to declare it and we have to set it to 0. And then we also need to do the same thing for total, which is something we'll use that will calculate the total. And we need to set that to 0 as well. Now, when we execute our loop, we're going to step through it 5 times. And each time through, we're going to ask the user to enter a number, and we're going to collect that number. We want to keep track of the total of these numbers as we go along. And then we want to increment the counter to make sure that we're counting to 5 within our loop. So we only do this 5 times. And then once we've reached the end of our loop, we've gone through it 5 times, then we're going to display a total. I hope you find this interesting and engaging as we go through this exercise. You might have known or noticed that when we went through the pseudocode a minute ago, we didn't specify the names of the variables, we didn't specify what kind of a loop we were going to use, or any of those things. That's much more common for pseudocode than what we've seen in the last few chapters. In the last few chapters, we've been more specific about what you were going to do because we felt like you needed a little more instruction. But now we're going to make it a little looser, and you can do it implement your program in different ways to achieve the same outcome. The pseudocode still applies because it still shows us the sequencing of events, but it just doesn't give you all the details. All right, so let's get our program rocking and rolling. We're going to create a class. Let's call this one my loop program. We're going to be gathering input. So let's put the scanner in here. We're going to do public, let's see, public static void main. Now notice I just showed you a shortcut that you can use when you're typing in public static void main using IntelliJ. This isn't going to work everywhere, but I just typed PSVM enter and it typed it all out for me. So from now on, we'll do that. Let's set up our scanner. Okay, now we know we need a couple of variables. We know we're going to need something that keeps track of how many times we go through the loop. So let's set that up, and we're going to initialize that at 0. Now notice I did this all in one step here. I could have done this, and this would be the same and it would be fine, but since this is just teaching you a little bit different way of doing things, we'll use this approach. We also need a variable that keeps track of our accumulated total, and we're going to start that out at 0 as well. All right, now we're going to go through our while loop. We need to go through it 5 times. And if you remember, the way that a while loop is, the way that it works is, it's going to keep going through the loop until it becomes false. So while, let's say the count variable we just used is less than 5, it's going to keep going through the loop. Okay, so one thing we know we're going to need to do down here somewhere is this. Now, if you remember, we talked a little bit about these common calculation methods, and this one, count plus plus, basically is the same thing as doing this. Count equals count plus 1, which is basically going to mean that it starts at 0, and then at the end of the first loop it'll be a 1, and the end of the second loop it'll be 2, and the end of the third loop it'll be 3, and so forth. Well, we're just going to use this way of writing that. All right, now we know that each time through the loop we need to ask the person for a number. So we need a label first. System out print enter a number to add, and we'll put a semicolon after that. All right, now we need to have the input. We need to gather the input. So we're going to do something a little crazy. We are going to initialize, declare a variable, and set the value, kind of like we did right here, but rather than it being a value of 0, it's going to be the input variable. Next, int. Now, one thing you should know here is that means that every single time, so this while loop is within a block, and this variable right here is called a local variable, and it's only local to this block. So if I try to do something with this variable out here, like something to do with number out here, it doesn't even know this thing exists. It only knows this variable exists within what's called the scope of this block right here. So what I say that because every time you come back through this loop, it's going to reinitialize and reset up this variable and set this new number to it. This is not an uncommon thing to do in programming. The next thing that we need to do inside of our loop here is we need to set the value of total. So total is going to equal total plus number, like this. Okay. So what that means is that the first time we come through here, total equals 0. So total equals 0 plus whatever the number is, let's say 10. So it will set the value here at 10. And the next time through the loop, it will say total equals 10 plus, and let's say we input a 20. So then it'll put a 30 here. It's going to accumulate the value through this. All right, so what that means is by the time we're to the count of 5, count equals 5 is greater than count. We're only going to do this while loop while count is less than 5. So as soon as count's 5, it's going to be false, and it's going to drop through here. Now, the reason why, and this can be a little tricky, so you have to kind of pay attention. The reason why this works by using not looking at equal to 5, but just looking at less than 5 is because count starts at 0. So the first time through it's 0, the next time through the loop it's 1, 2, 3, 4. So we've actually gone 5 times when count equals 4, and then it goes right here and it makes it 5, and now it drops out. I hope that makes sense. Okay, now outside of the while loop, because we don't want to do this every time we're going through that 5 times, now we're going to output the results of total. System out print line the total of the numbers is. Okay, now if you were to have put this line in here, you would see it 5 different times, and you would actually see the number go from 0 to 10 to 20 to 30 to whatever we put in the numbers are, but you would see it accumulate. That's not a bad thing, but for the purposes of this program, we just want to show the results one time. Okay, so that is our program. Take a good look at your program, make sure it looks right and everything's good, and now let's run it. Oops, run. Okay, now we know that it's going to ask us 5 times for a number. Now, here's a little test you can do. Let's make sure that your program asks you 5 times and no more than 5 times. If it does 4 times and then it displays the total, there's something wrong. If it asks you 6 times and it displays the total, there's something wrong. But let's go through this. So I'm just going to make this easy. I'm going to go 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, and then it displays the total. So it went through it 5 times. If yours did something else, come take a look, especially here. If you, for some reason, left this line out, it will go on forever. And in fact, you can hit escape or break, or you can click right here to stop, right? This little button right here to stop your program. if it's going to go on forever and ever. But if you had this be greater than 5, then it's never going to actually run the while loop, and it would just drop right down here and give you a 0 for the total, and so forth. So there's some things that you can look at just to make sure that your program is working correctly. Here are some more activities that you can try to learn even more about this topic.